background of the whole thing, why we did this, and like the whole reason why the whole strikes and everything started. You got to understand the concept of what exploitation is. So exploitation is the unfair advantage taken by those who own the means of production, such as factory owners, against the productive working class who commits their labor to produce commodities or products. Right, so there's like a simple equation for this. It's a subtraction. The total value created subtracted by the worker's wage is equal to a surplus value, which is what the factory owners pay. Alright, horrible working conditions and unreasonable hours just for the owner's own profit with no regards for the workers caused a series of events which follow. So up next is like a short video on working unions. Oh, okay.
So what is a worker union? A worker union is an organization of workers that bounded together and their goal was to secure their own rights. So on the right is a picture of a worker union, and these guys are protesting and worker riot one or the other is the side that they're holding. It shows that they are not willing to work unless they get more. So why did workers form unions? And there's a lot of benefits. So they gained higher wages in unions because they could protest more efficiently and they could fight for like their common goals, which are better working conditions and less working hours. And it strengthened numbers, of course, because if one worker protested, they could easily just fire him. But if the entire factory full of workers protested, they went on strike in order to fight for some sort of goal that they had, then it'd be much, much more efficient.
Vaidya. Yeah. Round of applause again. Moving on from the video, we answered this.
A worker union. So what is a worker?
Okay. Here it is. So where were the unions formed? They're formed anywhere with where the exploitation of labor existed. So that means mostly factories, sweatshops, steel mills, railroads, and all these places where there's a bunch of people working and they're being treated badly. A couple notable unions. One of them is National Labor Union, or the NLU. It's the first large-scale union that was founded in the U.S. It's formed in 1866 by an iron worker named William H. Silvis. Consists of 300 local unions, so it's like a smaller collection of unions that banded together, kind of, in 13 different states. And then the guy Silvis actually urges African and women to join the union also, but like eventually other union people like does not want them to join. So for the NLU, African Americans and women are left out. The number count was 640,000 people, and then they are also the ones that push for 8-hour working. The other one kind of serves as like an alternative to the NLU was Knights of Labor. It's formed 2 years later by Uriah Stephens, and then they actually are more like individual focused group rather than like a link between smaller unions, and they actually admit both women and men. And they do not prefer. They're like a more peaceful group, so they do not prefer strikes and protests, and they more like we got to make a compromise kind of. They're not as violent. So 8-hour work days is really important, and that's what we live off of right now.
Alright, so this is the general timeline for labor's rights. So between 1800 and 1825, the first permanent local unions were formed, and around 1850, unions were formed on the national level. And then between 1875 and 1890, Molly Maguire fought for minor rights. Big business was also formed during this time. And then after this, there were a few more strikes, including the homestead strike, the Bowman strike, and the steel strike. And then between 1910 and 1926, the open shop movement and mass manufacturing were initiated. And this timeline for workers goes way beyond this, but this is what started this entire movement.
So the IWW and the path of socialism. Eugene Debs, he was one of the really important socialists during that era. So he believes that the problem of the whole treatment of workers, the whole exploitation thing, was the problem, was the product of capitalism, which the U.S. obviously runs on. Private ownership and free competition made the rich richer while the poor was made even poorer. And then many other activists turned to this alternative route of socialism. And in 1905, a group of unionists and socialists gathered together to form the IWW, or the International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. And IWW welcomed both women and blacks together. The strikes and struggles. There was the Great Strike of 1877, pretty famous one. Workers of Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, they went on strike to protest the second wage cut in a couple of months. They're not happy with it. Strike spreads fast, spreads to every railroad line east of the Mississippi and then to Missouri, and then and other western lines. Basically, it was like a big area, the whole big area.
What is happening? I'm sorry.
When you hover over the weather thing, it pops up.
Yeah, so for more than a week, the whole railroad covering more than 50,000 miles just stopped because all of them went on strike. Nobody's working there anymore. Riots erupted in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco. People were taking them to the streets. The industrialists were shaken in fear of a socialist revolution, and then eventually troops were called in to suppress the workers and clear the way. A couple other notable strikes. The Haymarket Affair and the Homestead Strike, as Kevin said earlier. Haymarket Affair was, it came after the success of some other strikes, and then they were trying to imitate it, right? And then 1,300 protesters gathered at Chicago's Haymarket Square to protest the killing of one of the workers who was on strike earlier. Eventually, the police come to disperse the crowd, and someone threw a bomb. The bomb went off, and then suddenly, like, everyone just crashes with each other again. And then 7 officers and multiple workers dead, and then 8 men were arrested and hanged. So the Homestead Strike was, again, it's due to the unfair treatment of workers at Carnegie Steel Company. And then on July 6th, 1892, the company decided to cut wages, right? And then they actually hired armed guards to try to keep the whole plant running. And then 3 private detectives and 6 workers died in the crash that followed because the workers were trying to stop working. And then steel workers ousted the guards and shut down the whole plant, so nobody works anymore. And then eventually National Guards were called in to suppress the strike and the plant reopened. And then the union eventually failed and gave in to the company.
Alright, so here's a Venn diagram of the public view of unions. So some things that people thought was good is that they really supported the cause because they were advocating for worker rights for most of the people who were workers. And it actually built into the world to what it is today. Like Luke said earlier, there was the 9-to-5 worker, which was pioneered by worker strikes and worker unions. And like most people in society are not in the top 1%, they're not like wealthy people, so they are being exploited in general during this time to the political cause. Some bad things is that capitalists are scared that the workers will unite and overthrow them. That's one way negatively view the working unions. And strikes actually create a shortage of goods produced because workers are not working as hard as labor unions. And it actually creates some economic instabilities because of the strikes, because of the low production. And some things in common is there was a lot of protests, and during these protests there was force and violence used, and it will threaten the status of the rich wealthy.
It's a woman in the labor movement. So women also played a really important role in advocating for workers' rights. Some of the unions left them out, but that didn't stop them from really advocating for workers' rights. Then they fought for women's rights in the workplace, fought for policies to import and buy group action, by boycotting the strikes. So women also participated in boycotting the strikes. Mary Harris Jones was a prominent advocate for mine workers' rights. She helped organize a bunch of strikes and co-founded the IWW, an organization to organize the nation's workers into union and abolish capitalism because IWW was a socialist organization.
Alright, so government opposition and suppression of workers. So the more powerful unions became, naturally, the more capitalist employers would be afraid of them. And then some of them even refused to to accept unions. And then they even introduced these yellow dot contracts, which basically prevented the workers from joining in this labor movement. And then that prevented them from like fighting for their rights. And then the Sherman Antitrust Act, it made it very easy for the government to use disruption of interstate trade as a legitimate reason to crack down on the workers' protest. And then organizing strikes became increasingly difficult as the government restrictions tightened. And then strikes sometimes led to food shortages, making the public angry, and then many feared that they wouldn't get the supplies because of these workers.
Some things about unions today, unions still carried on to this day. A bunch of them are here to help people in need, including minorities, etc. Obviously now they're like much more inclusive. And then 2/3 of the workers contracted by unions are people of color and women. Unions fight for bad working conditions and child labor, and it's still working pretty effective and helpful to this day. And then active labor unions include Change to Win Foundation and the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations are the pictures down below, I believe. Here's our sources, and that's it. That's our presentation.